A perfect town's imperfect storm. The sun dipped low over the small town of Meadowville, painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson. Officer Richard Calloway adjusted his rearview mirror as he parked his patrol car outside the station, the quiet hum of the engine fading into the evening stillness. Meadowville was a quiet town, nestled between rolling hills and sprawling fields. It prided itself on its tight-knit community, where everyone knew each other, or thought they did. Richard, a man in his late 40s, with a stout build and a graying beard, had been a cop in Meadowville for nearly 20 years. To him, the town was more than just home, it was his kingdom. He knew every shop owner, every schoolteacher, and, as he often claimed, every troublemaker. But tonight, something felt off. The weight of change had been creeping into Meadowville ever since Captain Edward Ramsey took over the department. Ramsey was not from Meadowville. A veteran officer from the city, Ramsey was known for his progressive ideas, a stark contrast to the department's traditional, by-the-book ways. Richard had never been one to embrace change. To him, Ramsey's talk of reform, diversity training, and community connection felt like a foreign language. Why fix what isn't broken, he grumbled to himself, stepping into the station. The building was dimly lit, the fluorescent bulbs flickering overhead. Officers mingled in the lounge, sipping stale coffee, their chatter barely audible. As Richard made his way to his desk, he passed Captain Ramsey's office. The door was ajar, revealing the captain hunched over a stack of papers. Ramsey's sharp gaze lifted momentarily, locking eyes with Richard before returning to his work. Richard felt his chest tighten. He couldn't shake the feeling that Ramsey was silently judging him. By 8 p.m., the station had emptied out save for Richard and a few others finishing up reports. The radio crackled to life. Dispatch to 10 to 4, we've got a possible theft at Silvercrest Boutique on Main Street. Witness reports a young male acting suspiciously. Can you check it out? Richard grabbed his keys, eager to break the monotony. 10 to 4, I'm en route. Silvercrest Boutique was a high-end store in Meadowville's wealthier district. As he approached, he saw the dim glow of the shop's display windows spilling onto the cobblestone sidewalk. Outside, a boy, no older than 13, stood near the entrance, a backpack slung over his shoulder. Richard parked his car and observed for a moment. The boy seemed nervous, glancing around as though he were waiting for someone. The street was quiet, devoid of the usual evening strollers. Something's not right, Richard muttered, stepping out of the car. His boots clacked against the pavement as he approached. Hey, kid, Richard called out. The boy turned abruptly, his dark eyes wide with a mix of surprise and fear. He wore a crisp white shirt tucked into khaki shorts, but his trembling hands gave away his unease. What are you doing out here? Richard asked, his tone firm. I was just waiting, the boy stammered, clutching his backpack tighter. For what? Richard pressed, his eyes narrowing. The boy hesitated, glancing over his shoulder toward the store. Answer me, Richard demanded, taking a step closer. I didn't do anything wrong, the boy blurted, his voice cracking. Richard's suspicion deepened. He gestured toward the backpack. Let me see what's in the bag. No, the boy said, stepping back. It's private. Richard's patience snapped. Private, huh? You've got something in there you don't want me to see? The boy shook his head vigorously, but Richard wasn't buying it. In his mind, the pieces fit too perfectly, a nervous kid, a fancy store, a refusal to cooperate. Turn around, Richard ordered, pulling out his handcuffs. Wait, the boy pleaded, tears welling up in his eyes. I didn't steal anything. Richard ignored him, snapping the cuffs onto the boy's wrists. We'll sort this out at the station. As he led the boy to the patrol car, a woman burst out of the boutique. She was middle-aged, with a kind face that quickly twisted in alarm. Officer. Wait, she called out, waving a receipt in her hand. What's going on? This kid's been acting suspicious, Richard replied curtly. I'm taking him in for questioning. The woman looked at the boy, then at Richard, her expression a mix of confusion and concern. He didn't do anything wrong. That's Joshua. He was here picking up a special order, something for his mom's birthday. Richard hesitated for a fraction of a second, but his mind was already made up. He can explain that at the station. The boy, Joshua, hung his head as Richard loaded him into the back seat. The woman tried to intervene again, but Richard dismissed her with a wave. The ride to the station was silent save for Joshua's soft sniffles. Richard's grip tightened on the steering wheel. Maybe this will teach you a lesson, he muttered. Joshua didn't respond. At the station, Richard escorted Joshua inside, ignoring the curious glances from his colleagues. He directed the boy to sit in a chair by the processing desk. "All right, kid," Richard said, his tone harsh. "Give me your parents' number." Joshua hesitated, his hands trembling as he fumbled to retrieve the number. Richard grabbed the phone and dialed, his annoyance mounting. After 2 rings, a deep voice answered. "Hello? This is Officer Richard Calloway with the Meadowville Police Department," Richard said briskly. "We've detained your son for suspected theft. You need to come down here immediately." There was a pause on the other end. "I'll be there in 10 minutes, the voice said. The line went dead. Richard hung up and turned back to Joshua, who sat hunched over, his shoulders shaking. "Your dad's on his way," Richard said flatly. As the minutes ticked by, Richard began to feel the weight of his decision. What if the woman had been telling the truth? What if he had overreacted? Before he could dwell on it further, the station door burst open. A tall, imposing figure strode in, his presence commanding attention. It was Captain Edward Ramsey. Richard's heart sank as the captain's piercing gaze locked onto him. "Where's my son?" Ramsey demanded, his voice like thunder. The storm unleashed. The room fell silent, every officer in the station pausing to witness the scene unfolding before them. Captain Edward Ramsey stood in the doorway, his face a portrait of fury barely contained beneath his professional veneer. Behind him, the late evening sun cast long shadows into the room, amplifying the tension in the air. Richard's throat went dry, his pulse thundering in his ears. It felt as though time had slowed, the weight of his decision pressing down on him like a physical force. "Officer Calloway," Ramsey said, his voice low and cutting. "Where is my son?" For a moment, Richard couldn't find his voice. He looked at Joshua, seated in the hard plastic chair by the processing desk. The boy's head was bowed, his small frame trembling. Slowly, Joshua raised his tear-streaked face to meet his father's gaze, his lips quivering as he whispered, "Dad." Ramsey crossed the room in 3 long strides, kneeling in front of Joshua. His large hands rested gently on his son's shoulders as he examined him for any signs of harm. "Are you okay?" he asked, his tone softening only for his son. Joshua nodded, though his voice was barely audible. "I'm fine. But they think I stole something." "I didn't, Dad. I swear." Ramsey's jaw clenched, his body taut with restrained anger. He rose to his full height, turning to face Richard. "Explain. Now." Richard stammered, his confidence evaporating under the captain's searing glare. "Sir, I saw your son outside the Silvercrest boutique. He was acting suspiciously. When I asked him about the contents of his bag, he refused to cooperate. Given the circumstances, I believed I had probable cause." "Probable cause?" Ramsey interrupted, his voice rising. "Did you see him take anything? Did you speak to the store owner? Did you do any due diligence before cuffing and dragging my son to this station?" Richard hesitated, realizing the answer to all 3 questions was the same. "No, sir." Ramsey's eyes flashed with fury. "Then what you had was not probable cause. What you had was an assumption rooted in nothing but your own biases. Do you even know what my son was doing there?" Richard looked away, shame burning through him. "The store clerk said something about a gift," he muttered. "Yes," Ramsey said, his voice icy. "A gift for his mother. My wife." It was her birthday today, Officer Calloway. Joshua went to pick up a bracelet he and I ordered together, a surprise he was excited about. And instead of seeing him as a child doing something kind, you saw him as a criminal. Why? Because of the color of his skin? Because he doesn't look like the rest of the people in this neighborhood? The station was so silent that Richard could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning. Officers standing nearby exchanged uneasy glances, shifting on their feet but saying nothing. Richard struggled to defend himself, his pride battling with the growing realization of his mistake. "Sir, I didn't mean." "You didn't mean what?" Ramsey snapped, his voice cutting through Richard's attempt at justification. "You didn't mean to terrify my son? To humiliate him? Or do you mean you didn't mean to let your prejudices dictate your actions?" "Because that's exactly what happened here." Richard opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. Deep down, he knew Ramsey was right. He had acted on instinct, on the assumptions he had carried for years without question. Ramsey took a step closer, his imposing frame towering over Richard. "Do you have children, Officer Calloway?" Richard hesitated before nodding. "Yes, sir. 2 daughters." Ramsey's expression darkened. "Then imagine, for one moment, if this had been one of them. Imagine if someone had looked at your child and decided they were guilty without evidence, without even giving them a chance to explain. Would you stand for it?" Richard's stomach churned. The image of his daughters, scared and crying in a police station, flashed in his mind. He swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. "No, sir. I wouldn't." For a moment, Ramsey said nothing, his piercing gaze locked onto Richard. Then he turned to Joshua, his voice softening. "Come on, son. Let's get you out of here." Joshua nodded and stood, his small hand slipping into his father's. Ramsey began to lead him toward the door, but paused and turned back to the room. "This," he said, addressing the officers around him, "is exactly why we need to change. We cannot allow this kind of behavior to continue, not in this department, not in this town, not anywhere. If we are going to serve and protect this community, we need to do better. We need to be better." He looked back at Richard, his expression a mix of disappointment and resolve. "You will face disciplinary action for this, Officer Calloway. There will be a formal review, and until then, you're suspended. Effective immediately." Richard nodded, unable to argue. "Yes, sir." Ramsey turned and left, his hand resting protectively on Joshua's shoulder as they walked out into the night. The station remained eerily quiet after their departure. Richard sank into his chair, the weight of what had just happened settling over him like a heavy blanket. "Damn," someone muttered from across the room. Richard didn't look up. He couldn't. His mind raced, replaying every moment of the encounter, every choice he had made that led to this. He had always seen himself as a good cop, a man who upheld the law and kept his town safe. But now, for the first time, he questioned that perception. Had he let his biases go unchecked for years? How many other decisions had he made, guided not by evidence or reason, but by the same assumptions that had brought him to this moment? As the hours dragged on, Richard remained at his desk, staring blankly at the paperwork before him. He didn't leave until the station was nearly empty, the silence around him a stark contrast to the storm raging within. For Richard Calloway, the night marked the beginning of a reckoning, one that would challenge everything he thought he knew about himself, his town, and his role in it. A reckoning of conscience. Richard Calloway walked into his darkened home long after midnight, his mind churning with the events of the day. He slipped off his boots and set his badge on the kitchen counter, the metallic clink echoing in the empty room. His wife, Lauren, had left a note on the fridge, her neat handwriting a small comfort. "Dinner's in the fridge. I hope your day wasn't too rough. Love you." He sighed, his appetite gone, and made his way to the living room. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards. He sank into his recliner and stared at the ceiling, replaying the scene at the station over and over in his mind. Captain Ramsey's words cut deep. You didn't mean to let your prejudices dictate your actions? The phrase gnawed at him, each repetition unearthing uncomfortable truths he'd buried long ago. He had always prided himself on being a fair and just officer, yet Ramsey's confrontation made him question the foundation of that belief. Was he as unbiased as he had always assumed? A haunting reflection. Unable to sit still, Richard grabbed his old journal from the bookshelf. He hadn't written in it for years, but tonight, the urge to confront his thoughts was overwhelming. Flipping through its worn pages, he paused on an entry from his early days on the force. Policing is about instinct, Officer Warren told me on my first patrol. You've got to trust your gut. He had taken those words to heart, believing his instincts were honed by experience. But what if his gut had been fed by flawed narratives, subtle biases, and years of unchecked assumptions? The faces of other young men he had arrested over the years came to mind. Some had been guilty, others not. But in hindsight, how many of those arrests had been shaped by the same assumptions that had led him to handcuff Joshua Ramsey without question? He set the journal down, his chest tightening with guilt. Dad? The soft voice startled him. He looked up to see his youngest daughter, Emma, standing in the doorway. Her hair was tousled from sleep, and she clutched a stuffed bear to her chest. Hey, sweetheart, he said, his voice softening. What are you doing up? I heard you come in, she said, padding over to him. You okay? Richard managed a faint smile. I'm fine, kiddo. Just a long day. Emma climbed onto his lap, nestling against him. Mom says you keep the bad guys away. Did you catch any today? The question hit him like a punch to the gut. He thought about Joshua, about the tears in the boy's eyes as he pleaded his innocence. Emma's words felt like a spotlight shining on his failure. No, he said quietly. Not today. Emma yawned and rested her head on his chest. It's okay, Daddy. You'll get them tomorrow. He held her close, the innocence in her words both comforting and heartbreaking. She had no idea how complicated the world really was. Or how her father had just contributed to making it worse for a boy not much older than her. After Emma fell asleep in his arms, Richard carried her to her room and tucked her in. Standing in the doorway, he watched her sleep for a while, her peaceful face a stark contrast to the turmoil within him. He realized then that he owed it to his daughters, to Emma and her older sister, Grace, to be better. To leave them a world where they wouldn't have to question whether they were safe, or whether their father's actions had made someone else unsafe. The next morning, Richard woke early, his sleep restless. He decided to return to the station even though he was officially suspended. He needed to make things right, or at least take the first step toward doing so. The morning air was crisp, the town just beginning to stir. Richard parked his car a block away from the station, needing the walk to clear his head. As he approached the station, he spotted Captain Ramsey exiting his car, with Joshua by his side. Richard hesitated, his feet feeling like they were rooted to the ground. But then Joshua noticed him. Their eyes met, and for a moment, neither moved. Officer Calloway, Ramsey said, his tone neutral but firm. Captain, Richard said, inclining his head respectfully. Joshua. Joshua clung to his father's side, his expression wary. I came to apologize, Richard said, directing his words toward the boy. What I did was wrong. I didn't give you a chance to explain, and I made assumptions I had no right to make. I'm sorry for scaring you, for treating you like a criminal when you were just being a good son. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed to tell you that face to face. Joshua's grip on his father's hand tightened. He didn't speak, but his eyes softened slightly, the fear replaced by something closer to cautious curiosity. Ramsey nodded. Acknowledging your mistake is a start, Officer Calloway. But it's not enough. Words are easy. Change is hard. I know, Richard said. And I'm ready to do the hard work. I want to earn back the trust I've lost, yours, Joshua's, and the community's. Ramsey studied him for a long moment before speaking. There's a community outreach meeting tonight at the Civic Center. I'll be there, speaking with residents about how we can improve our relationship with them. If you're serious about change, show up. Listen to their stories. Hear what they have to say about the impact of actions like yours. Richard nodded. I'll be there. Ramsey's expression softened slightly, though his eyes remained guarded. Good. But don't expect this to be easy. People are angry, and they have every right to be. I understand, Richard said. Joshua tugged at his father's sleeve. Dad, can we go now? Ramsey placed a hand on his son's shoulder and nodded. Let's go. As they walked away, Richard stood there, watching them disappear into the station. A part of him felt lighter, knowing he had taken the first step. But another part felt heavier, knowing how much work lay ahead. The meeting. That evening, Richard entered the Civic Center, feeling out of place and nervous. The room was packed with residents, black, white, Latino, young, old, all there to voice their concerns. Captain Ramsey stood at the front, his presence commanding but calm. When Richard entered, a hush fell over the crowd, eyes turning toward him. He could feel their judgment, their anger, their disappointment. He didn't blame them. Ramsey gestured for him to sit, and Richard found a spot near the back. For the next 2 hours, he listened as residents shared their stories. Stories of being stopped for no reason, of being treated with suspicion in their own neighborhoods, of fearing the very people who were supposed to protect them. It was a humbling, painful experience. But it was also necessary. When the meeting ended, Richard approached Ramsey. Thank you for letting me come, he said. Ramsey nodded. This is just the beginning, Calloway. If you're serious about change, you'll keep showing up. Not just to meetings like this, but in how you do your job, how you treat people, how you think. Every day, every decision. I will, Richard said, his voice steady. As he left the Civic Center that night, Richard felt a small glimmer of hope. Change wouldn't come quickly or easily, but he was determined to see it through, for Joshua, for his daughters, and for himself. Paths of Redemption. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest in Richard Calloway's life. Each day felt like a tightrope walk, balancing between a past he could no longer ignore and the uncertain future he was trying to shape. His suspension stretched on, leaving him plenty of time to think, but little in the way of resolution. Lauren noticed the change in him almost immediately. You've been quiet, she said one evening as they sat on the porch, the warm glow of the setting sun casting long shadows across the yard. More than usual. Richard shrugged, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Just thinking. About what? He hesitated, unsure how to put his thoughts into words. About who I am. And who I thought I was. Lauren placed a hand on his arm, her touch grounding him. You've always tried to do the right thing, Richard. That's why I fell in love with you. But trying isn't always enough. Sometimes you have to unlearn things you didn't even know you were taught. Her words stayed with him, echoing in his mind as he attended more community meetings, listened to more stories, and began to truly see the world through the eyes of the people he'd once sworn to protect. A visit to Joshua's school. It was Ramsey who suggested the visit. There's an after-school program at the community center, he said one morning after Richard had stopped by the station to check in. Joshua's part of it. They're always looking for volunteers. Might be a good way to show him, and the other kids, that you're serious about making amends. Richard hesitated. The idea of facing Joshua again, especially in front of his peers, filled him with a deep unease. But he knew Ramsey was right. Words alone wouldn't fix anything. The community center was buzzing with activity when he arrived that afternoon. Children of all ages ran through the halls, their laughter echoing off the walls. Richard felt out of place in his civilian clothes, the absence of his uniform making him feel exposed. Officer Calloway. The voice startled him, and he turned to see Joshua standing near the entrance to the gym, a basketball in his hands. Hey, Joshua, Richard said, his voice steady but cautious. Joshua didn't say anything at first, just looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. "My dad said you might come," the boy finally said. "Said you're trying to do better." "I am," Richard said earnestly. "And not just for me. For you. For everyone." Joshua seemed to consider this for a moment before nodding. "You any good at basketball?" Richard laughed, the tension in his chest loosening ever so slightly. "Not really. But I can try." The hours that followed were a revelation. Richard found himself laughing with the kids, cheering them on, and even making a few decent shots himself. By the end of the afternoon, his shirt was soaked with sweat, and his heart felt lighter than it had in weeks. As he left the center, Joshua ran up to him. "Thanks for coming," the boy said, his voice quiet but sincere. Richard knelt down so they were at eye level. "Thanks for giving me a chance, Joshua. I won't waste it." Confronting the past. The next step in Richard's journey came unexpectedly. During one of the community meetings, an older black man named Mr. Harris approached him. "I remember you," Mr. Harris said, his voice tinged with both sadness and resolve. "About 5 years ago, you arrested my grandson, Jamal." Richard's stomach sank. He didn't need to ask for details. The name alone brought back memories of a routine traffic stop that had escalated unnecessarily. "I've thought about that day a lot," Richard admitted. "And I'm sorry for how I handled it. Jamal deserved better." Mr. Harris studied him for a long moment. "You ever reach out to him?" Richard shook his head. "I didn't think he'd want to hear from me." "You might be surprised," Mr. Harris said. "He's doing well now, but that day, it left a mark. Not just on him, but on all of us." That conversation stayed with Richard, and a few days later, he found himself dialing a number he hadn't used in years. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was cautious, unfamiliar. "Jamal, this is Richard Calloway. I was the officer who—" "I know who you are," Jamal interrupted, his tone cold. Richard took a deep breath. "I called to apologize. I know that doesn't erase what happened, but I needed to say it. What I did that day was wrong. I let my assumptions guide my actions, and I hurt you because of it. I'm sorry." There was a long pause. Richard could hear the faint sound of traffic in the background, the hum of life, continuing as he waited for Jamal's response. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Jamal finally said. "But I appreciate you saying it." "That's all I can ask for," Richard said. "A new beginning." As the months passed, Richard began to see the fruits of his efforts. His suspension was lifted, but he returned to the force with a renewed sense of purpose, and a deeper understanding of the responsibility he carried. He worked closely with Ramsey to implement new training programs, focusing on implicit bias and community engagement. He attended every meeting he could, not as an officer, but as a listener. And slowly, he began to rebuild the trust he had lost. One evening, as he walked through his neighborhood, he spotted Joshua riding his bike. The boy waved, a genuine smile on his face. "Hey, Officer Calloway." "Hey, Joshua," Richard called back, his heart swelling with gratitude. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was on the right path. The road ahead was still long, but he was ready to walk it, one step at a time. Restoring trust and finding redemption. Richard Calloway had never anticipated how a single mistake would redefine his life. He had spent years in law enforcement, firmly believing that his role was simply about maintaining order, protecting the community, and ensuring justice was served. But as he now walked through the same streets he once patrolled with unquestioning authority, he couldn't escape the weight of his past actions. Every interaction, every apology, every encounter seemed like another small step in the long process of repairing what he had broken. But he was determined to make it right, no matter the cost. The media had quickly picked up the story of his wrongful arrest of Joshua Burns, and Richard had spent countless hours apologizing, sometimes in private, sometimes publicly, attempting to redeem himself in the eyes of the community. Captain Burns, a man whose authority Richard had once resented, had become an unexpected ally, helping guide Richard through the aftermath. Joshua had been a central figure in his journey, a symbol of the very thing he'd failed to see in the moment: innocence, potential, and humanity. The boy had forgiven him, but forgiveness didn't erase the need for action. And so, Richard moved forward, determined to change. The process of rebuilding. For Richard, it was clear that reform wasn't just about apologizing or making grand gestures. It was about learning, unlearning, and adapting. His first real step towards redemption came through an initiative he started within the police department, one that aimed not only to address the biases that had led to Joshua's wrongful arrest, but also to redefine the way officers engaged with their communities. The project was called Community First, and it involved police officers being paired with local activists, educators, and community leaders to understand the root causes of crime, the systemic inequalities that had plagued their neighborhoods for years, and most importantly, the stories of the people they served. Officers spent time in local schools, attended town hall meetings, and volunteered at local organizations. They weren't just policing, they were engaging. They were listening. And in doing so, they began to see their town through a different lens. Richard had been the driving force behind the initiative, dedicating every ounce of energy into its success. At first, many of his fellow officers were skeptical. Some questioned whether it would really make a difference. Others felt that it was too touchy-feely or too much like political correctness. But as time went on, more and more officers began to see the value in it. It was hard to argue with the facts. The neighborhoods they patrolled had started to feel safer. The tense standoffs between police and community members had decreased. People began to speak to officers with respect, but also with genuine trust. Richard had become a staunch advocate for reform, and it wasn't lost on him that much of this transformation had come because he had been forced to confront his own faults. And yet, he knew that no program or initiative could ever fully make up for the pain he had caused Joshua and his family. A hard conversation. One crisp autumn morning, Richard stood at the front of a room filled with fellow officers. His hands were slightly clammy, the familiar nerves settling in as he prepared to speak at the department's quarterly training session. As Captain Burns had expected, the Community First initiative had worked better than anyone had anticipated. Crime rates in certain areas were down, arrests were down, and morale was higher than it had been in years. But still, there were lingering questions in the department about whether this new way of policing was sustainable. Richard had been asked to speak about the importance of empathy and community engagement in law enforcement, but today, he was going to do something different. Today, he was going to own his past. "I'm not here to tell you that I've got it all figured out," Richard began, his voice steady but filled with vulnerability. "I'm not here to pretend that the road I'm on is easy. What I'm here to tell you is that this job, this life we've chosen, it's about trust. And trust isn't something you can just claim. It's something you earn. And sometimes, you earn it the hard way." The room grew quiet as Richard took a deep breath. "A few months ago, I made a mistake. A big one. And that mistake cost someone, an innocent person, something far more valuable than I could ever have imagined. It cost him his dignity. It cost him his safety. And it could have cost him much more. And for that, I am sorry." Richard paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. He had practiced this speech 1,000 times in his head, but there was something different now. He wasn't speaking to a room of faceless officers, he was speaking to people he had once considered colleagues, but who now saw him with eyes full of doubt and skepticism. "I wrongly arrested a young man named Joshua Burns. I didn't stop to ask questions. I didn't listen. I saw the color of his skin, and I let my assumptions take over. I failed him. And more importantly, I failed all of you. Because when I failed Joshua, I failed the trust that binds this community together." He let the weight of his words settle in the room, and for the first time in months, Richard didn't feel the need to justify or defend himself. This wasn't about him. It wasn't about his pride. It was about accountability. "I don't expect any of you to just forget about what happened. I wouldn't expect that from anyone, Richard continued, his voice filled with sincerity. But what I ask is that we all take this as a lesson. We must do better. We must listen more. We must see each person as they are, not as a stereotype, not as an assumption, but as a human being. As he finished speaking, the room remained silent for a few long seconds. Then, slowly, one by one, officers began to nod, some even offering quiet applause. Richard's heart swelled with hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was how things were going to change. A meeting with Joshua's father. The next day, Richard found himself face to face with Captain Burns once more. This time, the meeting was personal. They had never really spoken in detail about the incident, not beyond the professional boundaries of the police station. But now, sitting across from Joshua's father, Richard felt the weight of his actions bearing down on him once again. Joshua's doing well, Captain Burns said, his voice quieter than usual. He's still angry, and rightfully so. But he's not giving up on the world. His eyes softened slightly as he glanced at Richard. And I think you're doing what you can to make things right. That means a lot. Richard swallowed hard, his throat dry. I want to be a part of the change. I want to help fix the things I broke. But I know it's going to take more than words. Captain Burns nodded. It will. But the fact that you're willing to do the work? That's something. I can't ask for more than that. Richard wasn't sure if he was forgiven, if he ever could be, but at that moment, he knew that redemption wasn't something to be granted, it was something to be earned. And he was finally ready to put in the work. The future of justice. Months passed, and Richard's transformation was evident. His presence on the streets had changed. He no longer relied solely on authority or fear to maintain order. Instead, he used his role to create opportunities for dialogue, cooperation, and understanding. He spent time in schools, talking to young kids about their rights, their responsibilities, and the importance of working together for the common good. He sat in on town meetings, engaging in the kind of open conversations that had once been foreign to him. Joshua was no longer just a symbol of Richard's failure, he had become a reminder of the power of second chances, of the potential for growth and change. And while the road ahead was still long, Richard knew he was walking it in the right direction. The truth was, redemption wasn't a destination. It was a journey. And Richard Calloway had taken the first steps down a path that would hopefully lead not only to healing for himself, but to healing for his entire community. The work would never be done, but for the first time in his career, he was willing to do whatever it took to make things right.